70%. That was the average fatality rate for crews inside Germany's most common tank of the Second World War, the Panzer IV. For every 10 young men who climbed into its steel shell, 7 would never come back. On paper, the Panzer IV should have been a survivor's machine. It was versatile, rugged, and produced in staggering numbers. More than 8,500 rolled off German assembly lines, fighting from the burning deserts of North Africa to the frozen fields of the Eastern Front. To its designers, it was the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored spearhead, a tank meant to outlast, outgun, and outmaneuver. But reality on the battlefield was far crueler. These crews were trapped in a machine that was neither the fastest, nor the strongest, nor the safest. Every time its armor was pierced, men were shredded, burned, or suffocated within seconds. The Panzer IV became less a weapon of victory and more a steel coffin on treads. Behind every statistic was a story: a loader crushed by a shell explosion, a gunner choking on fire and smoke, a driver who knew that bailing out meant being machine-gunned in the open. This is the forgotten truth of the Panzer IV. Not just a war machine, but a death sentence for most who served inside it. And to understand why so many never survived, we must go back to the beginning. The Panzer IV did not emerge in a vacuum. It was born out of the chaos and ambition of Adolf Hitler's Germany in the late 1930s, when the Reich prepared for a war of expansion across Europe. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was the doctrine, and tanks were its spearhead. Fast, armored columns punching deep into enemy territory, supported by aircraft and artillery, would collapse nations in weeks. At the heart of this vision stood the Panzer IV. When war erupted in 1939, it was clear why this machine mattered. Europe was a patchwork of flat plains, rivers, and cities, terrain where tanks could decide entire campaigns. In Poland, the Panzer IV rolled across farmland and shattered defenses. In France, it pushed through the Ardennes and forced Britain's army back to the beaches of Dunkirk. Everywhere it appeared, the tank became both a weapon and a symbol, proof that Germany's armored core was unstoppable. But geography would soon turn against it. In North Africa, the desert sun baked its steel and clogged its engines with sand. On the Eastern Front, winter froze its tracks and immobilized entire divisions. And everywhere, Allied engineers raced to build deadlier weapons: anti-tank rifles, bazookas, and bigger guns designed specifically to kill the Panzer IV. For the soldiers who crewed it, the stakes could not have been higher. The Wehrmacht depended on these men to hold conquered ground and spearhead attacks. The Allies, meanwhile, understood that breaking the Panzer IV meant breaking the backbone of German armor itself. The stage was set. Across deserts, forests, and frozen fields, this tank would fight in every theater of the war. But for the men inside, the question was never whether they would fight. It was whether they would live long enough to escape the burning wreckage. When the Panzer IV first entered service in 1939, it was not designed to be Germany's ultimate tank. It was, in fact, intended as a support weapon, a medium vehicle to accompany faster Panzer IIIs, using its short 75mm gun to destroy enemy bunkers, artillery, and infantry positions. Few inside the Wehrmacht believed it would one day become the backbone of the entire armored corps. The first units to receive it were proud, well-drilled formations, men trained under the ruthless precision of the Panzerwaffe. Their commanders were ambitious officers shaped by the doctrine of blitzkrieg. Heinz Guderian, the brilliant prophet of armored warfare, envisioned columns of tanks punching through enemy lines and racing deep into rear areas. For his men, speed and shock were the essence of victory. In the months before the invasion of Poland, crews prepared relentlessly. Drivers rehearsed rapid maneuvers across muddy fields. Gunners memorized the sound of shells slamming home. Loaders trained until their hands blistered from slamming rounds into the breech. Logistics officers worked to coordinate fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, knowing that a tank was only as deadly as its supply lines. Yet there were cracks even before the first battle. German intelligence consistently underestimated the number and strength of enemy tanks. Against France, planners assumed their panzers would face only light opposition, failing to anticipate the thick armor of the Char B1 or the Matilda II. Even the Panzer IV, for all its promise, was vulnerable to weapons it was never designed to withstand. But in those early days, The mood was confident, almost electric. Soldiers joked around campfires, convinced that their new machines made them untouchable. The steel hull around them felt like invincibility itself. Propaganda reinforced the myth. Panzer divisions were celebrated as the sharp edge of Germany's might, the modern knights of a new kind of war. And then came the silence before impact. Tanks lined up in their hidden positions, engines idling low. Commanders leaned out of open hatches, binoculars pressed to their eyes. Crews waited inside the dim, oil-scented interiors, sweat running down their necks as they gripped controls and loaded shells. The orders were simple: drive forward, crush resistance, and never stop moving. Few of those men realized that in the coming years, the very tank they trusted to protect them would become the most common grave in the German army. The first engines roared. Treads churned mud and gravel. Guns elevated. And the war for Europe, with the Panzer IV at its heart, was about to erupt in fire. The first clashes of the Panzer IV were swift, brutal, and deceptively successful. In Poland and later in France, the tank did exactly what its designers had intended. It smashed through infantry strongpoints, blasted apart bunkers, and sent defenders fleeing in terror. Columns of gray steel moved like unstoppable hammers, carving open gaps for German infantry to flood through. To many of the young crews inside, it felt as if the Blitzkrieg doctrine was invincible. But war has a way of punishing arrogance. By the time the Panzer IV rolled into the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the confidence of its crews met the immovable force of Russian geography. Roads became endless stretches of mud, swallowing tanks whole. Dust choked the engines in summer, snow and ice froze the tracks in winter. Fuel convoys lagged behind, leaving machines stranded and vulnerable. The steel beasts that had seemed unstoppable in France suddenly looked fragile, sputtering, and exposed. And then came the shock of the Red Army's response. Instead of collapsing, Soviet defenders fought with a ferocity the Germans had not anticipated. Entire villages became traps, anti-tank guns hidden in barns, mines buried in narrow dirt roads, ambushes waiting at every tree-line. German crews who expected quick victories instead found themselves staring down the barrels of T-34s, whose sloped armor shrugged off Panzer IV shells. For a moment, there were flashes of hope. The upgraded long-barrel version of the Panzer IV began to arrive, finally giving crews a weapon capable of piercing Soviet armor. In some battles, German gunners destroyed dozens of enemy tanks, their confidence momentarily restored. But for every small victory, the enemy adapted faster. Soviet factories produced tanks by the thousands, overwhelming the battlefield with sheer numbers. The Allies in the West, too, were learning. In North Africa, British Matildas and American Shermans proved that the Panzer IV was no longer the king of the desert. German tankers found themselves facing ambushes from well-concealed anti-tank guns, shells ripping through side armor that had once felt safe. Inside the cramped interiors, the illusion of invincibility cracked. Crews began to notice how thin their protection really was, how easily fire spread once a shell penetrated, how every hit could turn their machine into a coffin. And as casualty reports mounted, whispers spread among tankers. The Panzer IV was no longer a shield. It was a gamble. The battlefield was shifting, and with it, the fate of every man who stepped into the tank. The real horror, the years of attrition, firestorms, and death on an industrial scale, was only beginning. The war had reached its breaking point. By 1943, the Panzer IV was everywhere, from the deserts of Tunisia to the vast killing grounds of the Eastern Front. It was no longer the symbol of victory. It was a machine caught in the storm of total war. The battles grew closer, louder, more desperate. Inside a Panzer IV, the air was suffocating. Oil fumes mixed with sweat and gunpowder. The loader slammed round after round into the 75mm gun, his hands raw and blistered. The gunner pressed his eye to the sight, straining to pick out targets through smoke and dust. The driver hunched low, eyes burning, as he fought to keep the tank moving over shell-cratered earth. Every man knew, one hit from a Soviet gun could turn their steel cocoon into a furnace. And those hits came fast. The Soviets had perfected the ambush. Camouflaged T-34s lurked in tree lines, their 76mm guns thundering at close range. Anti-tank rifles cracked from hidden nests. Mines ripped apart tracks, leaving panzers stranded, helpless. Crews scrambled to repair them under fire, bullets snapping overhead, shells bursting around them. The Germans fought back with precision. The long-barreled Panzer IV could kill AT-34 if its gunner struck first. At Kursk, entire fields became graveyards of burning steel, German and Soviet wrecks littering the horizon. Panzer crews destroyed dozens of enemy machines in a single day, but it came at a terrible price. For every enemy tank burning, another emerged from the smoke. The noise was relentless. The metallic hammer of machine guns, the deep, cracking roar of artillery, the shriek of Katyusha rockets filling the sky. Each sound carried terror. Each vibration through the hull reminded the crew that death was inches away. Sometimes it was instant. A shell would smash through the armor, shattering men before they could even cry out. Sometimes it was worse. The heat of a penetrating round ignited ammunition, turning the tank into an inferno. Crews clawed at hatches, screaming as fire swallowed them alive. The stench of burning fuel and flesh spread across the battlefield, a smell survivors would never forget. Yet there was bravery too. Crews who stayed at their posts, gunners who kept firing until the turret jammed, drivers who refused to abandon comrades even as flames licked at their boots. Some tanks fought until their last shell was fired, their last breath drawn. But the tide could not be held back. Allied air power swept in, thunderbolts, typhoons, and Sturmovix tearing columns apart with rockets and bombs. The Panzer IV, once Germany's workhorse, became a target on open ground. Its armor, never designed to withstand such fury, melted under aerial fire. Both sides bled. Soviet tankers often died by the dozen, charging headlong into German guns. Allied crews burned and Shermans struck by 88s. Fields of wreckage stretched for miles, proof that war consumed men and machines alike. Still, numbers told the truth. Germany could not replace its losses. Factories destroyed, fuel scarce, crews irreplaceable. The Panzer IV was fighting to its last breath, but the outcome was already written. The decisive blow was not a single battle, but the realization whispered among German crews. Their tank, their war, their very survival was doomed. When the smoke cleared, the fields were unrecognizable. Steel carcasses lay blackened and twisted, their turrets blown apart, their tracks half buried in churned earth. Dead men remained inside many of them, silent, charred silhouettes in machines that had once felt invincible. The Panzer IV, Germany's workhorse, was now scattered in ruins across every front. The cost was staggering. By the end of 1943, entire panzer divisions had been gutted. Thousands of tanks were destroyed in Russia, North Africa, and later in Italy. Tens of thousands of crewmen were gone, killed, captured, or maimed beyond recognition. For Germany, each lost tank was more than a piece of steel. It was 4 or 5 trained men who could never be replaced. Notable commanders met grim fates. Veterans who had survived Poland and France fell to Soviet shells outside Kursk. Others were lost in fiery ambushes in the hedgerows of Normandy. Some bailed out, only to be cut down by machine gun fire as they tried to flee burning wrecks. The few who lived long enough to surrender often faced years of imprisonment, haunted by the screams of their comrades. For the Allies, the destruction of the Panzer IV marked a turning point. Soviet tank armies surged forward, reclaiming ground mile by mile. In the West, Allied advances grew bolder as German armor thinned. Air superiority and mass production tipped the scales further, ensuring that no matter how bravely German crews fought, they could not match the tide against them. By 1944, the Panzer IV was still fighting, but not as the spearhead it had once been. It had become a desperate shield, thrown again and again into hopeless battles, a relic struggling against the inevitable. The war was far from over, but for the men inside Germany's most common tank, the ending had already been written in fire and blood. Today, the Panzer IV is remembered less for its victories and more for its endurance. It was not the most powerful tank of the war, nor the most innovative, but it became the most common face of Germany's armored forces. From the first lightning strikes of 1939 to the last desperate battles in 1945, it was there, always fighting, always burning. Its legacy is one of contradiction. For historians, It is a symbol of German engineering stretched beyond its limits, a machine upgraded and rearmed again and again in a vain attempt to keep pace with the Allies. For soldiers, it is remembered as both a companion and a coffin, a steel shell that gave hope of survival, but more often delivered death. The sheer loss of Panzer IV crews reshaped German strategy. Blitzkrieg, once a doctrine of speed and surprise, crumbled into defensive attrition. The tank that had been designed to spearhead offensives was forced into the role of a battered shield. In the end, it could not save the Reich, nor the men who served it. Museums and memorials still display surviving Panzer IVs. Children climb on their tracks, unaware that tens of thousands of men once died inside them. For veterans, the site carries a weight words cannot convey. The memory of smoke, fire, and silence after screams. The Panzer IV was never meant to be a tomb, but history remembers it as exactly that. And the true cost of war is not written in numbers or machines, but in the lives swallowed whole by them.